now to Auckland's water supply. Waikato is arguably the most productive dairy area in the world. Rich countryside, highly efficient farmers, the world's biggest dairy company processing much of the milk. But running through this countryside is the Waikato River, and since 2002 Auckland has sourced about 10% of its water from that river. Do some of Waikato's 1.2 million cows end up pooing in that river? Yes, they do. Tristram Clayton reports.
This is a story about a river that flows clear and crisp from the northern tip of Lake Taupo and ends here at Port Waikato on the Tasman Sea. So what happens along the way? How does the Waikato River's 425-kilometre journey affect its health? I'm just a few hundred metres from the source of the Waikato here in Taupo. The water here looks crystal clear, but to make sure, I'm going to take some samples and then compare them with more samples from further down the river. We test 5 spots at 100-kilometre intervals along the river: Taupo, Mangakino, Tamahere, Taupiri and finally Tuako. We're now just 20 kilometres from where the Waikato enters the Tasman Sea. It's also the spot where around 50 million litres of water a day is taken from the river, treated and then pumped into the Auckland water supply. In our sights are 2 main forms of pollution: nitrogen and E. coli. Nitrogen causes noxious plants to grow. This chokes waterways and causes all other life to die. E. coli comes from human or animal faeces. Ingesting it will make you sick. Here at the source, what's your view of the purity of the water?
Clean enough to drink. I have no problem dipping my cup in there and drinking it straight out. And it makes the best coffee in Taupo.
So is he right? 3 days later, the results are in. Our first 2 test sites give satisfactory readings. E. coli is low, although still unsafe to drink, and nitrogen is about half the acceptable limit. But soon after Cambridge, the river changes. Total nitrogen jumps alarmingly, and E. coli levels skyrocket. At Taupiri, downstream from Ngaruawahia, the bacteria is more than 55% over the safe limit for swimming. Swallowing even small amounts of this water can be dangerous.
In the last 10 years, we've had 2 occasions where algal growth, fuelled by nitrogen phosphorus in the river, has led to health warnings, and it's caused problems for the people who take drinking water from the river.
Bill Vant says the river is much cleaner than it was in the 1960s. In those days, raw sewage was pumped straight into the river. But the contaminants we detected are still a concern.
I don't think you'd be wise to swim or drink it. You'd want to be pretty careful because of the level of E. coli, fecal bacteria that ends up in the river, particularly after it's been raining.
So where do all those nasties come from? And why does water quality suddenly deteriorate around Hamilton? If you're thinking sewerage and industry, you're only partly right. The Hamilton Sewage Treatment Plant is the river's single biggest point source polluter. That's where pollution comes from a pipe. The Kinleith Pulp and Paper Mill, Fonterra's Tarapa factory and the AFCO Meatworks in Horatu are the next biggest. So by the time the river reaches Ngaruawahia, just downstream, those 4 big polluters have already pumped almost 500,000 cubic metres of wastewater into the river every day. But as it turns out, they're only a small part of the problem. And this is why. Agriculture, in particular dairy farming, now accounts for around 3/4 of all the contaminants found in the river. Yes, that's right, 3/4.
It's leaching into the river and it's getting worse. And the reason it's getting worse is because we've had this massive expansion and intensification of dairy through the Waikato. So it's like for every herd of 1,000 cows you see, it's like 14,000 people doing their business in the field, and all of that ends up one way or another getting into the river.
There are strict rules surrounding how effluent collected in dairy sheds should be disposed of. But with 1.2 million cows scattered over 4,000 Waikato dairy farms, enforcement isn't easy.
Out of the 700 farms we monitored last year, there was around 20% that were significantly non-compliant.
And how many prosecutions?
Last year, around 5 prosecutions.
Are you happy with that level?
Well, it's about the amount of resources we've got to be able to do the job and about sending the message that we need to send.
Do you think you're sending a message?
Yes, I absolutely do.
With only 5 out of 120 prosecutions?
You look at the profile that the dairy effluent prosecutions that we're doing has got. They're high profile, and certainly we believe that farmers out there on the ground are starting to understand the significant risks associated with being non-compliant.
Environment Waikato found 120 farms that were significantly non-compliant when it came to effluent. That's 120 farms too many as far as Fonterra is concerned, and we're taking every possible step to halve that number inside of 18 months and have it trending to zero.
Tim Dean says he'd be happy to see more monitoring of dairy farms and points out that if farmers repeatedly break the rules, Fonterra will, and has, refused to take their milk. But is that enough? Should we be looking to limit herd concentration?
Well, New Zealand's got to make that decision. In our view, those sorts of punitive measures aren't required. But if New Zealand decides that they want to reduce income, then there are big consequences. $7 billion of New Zealand's export earnings comes from the Waikato Basin, and so we've got to balance economic and environmental issues.
Economics versus environment, arguably the 21st century's biggest challenge.